It's Thursday, November 27th, and somewhere behind the sealed doors of a Manhattan federal courthouse, an empty chair waits at the defense table like a threat. A single chain dangles from its leg, ready to lock around the ankle of the most radioactive inmate in the country. Outside, sirens blur into camera shutters. Reporters speak into microphones with that rehearsed urgency, and every headline is already pointing in the same direction. A leaked prison video, a system under fire, and the terrifying possibility that a man who thought he was counting down a sentence in years might walk out of this building today with that number replaced by one word: life. No jury, no new witnesses, no surprise trial. Just a judge, a pair of silent clips from inside a federal prison, and a decision the internet has already decided must be brutal. Before we step into that courtroom together, do one thing. Hit like on this video so more people see what's really happening here. Drop a comment right now and tell me this. Do you think these prison leaks are exposing corruption or being used as an excuse to destroy Diddy? And make sure you're subscribed with the bell on, because what you're about to hear is only one chapter in a case that has been building for months. To understand how we reached a Thursday like this, you have to rewind to the moment his fall stopped being gossip and became evidence. It started quietly on paper in November 2023, when the first wave of civil lawsuits hit. Women came forward accusing Sean Diddy Combs of sexual assault, violence, manipulation, and trafficking-style behavior, claims he denied. But that shattered the polished image he'd curated for decades. What looked to some like old drama or industry rumor suddenly turned into official filings with dates, locations, and patterns. Each new lawsuit didn't just add to the pile, it widened the picture. Then came March 25th, 2024, the day everything went from courtroom to crime scene. Federal agents from Homeland Security Investigations hit his homes in Los Angeles and Miami at the same time, serving search warrants in connection with an ongoing sex trafficking probe. The footage was surreal. Armed agents at the gates of multi-million-dollar properties, black SUVs, tactical vests, a canine being led toward a house that had once hosted music videos and celebrity parties. Commentators said it looked like a movie raid. It wasn't. It was the moment federal law wrapped itself around his life and refused to let go. For a while, nothing public seemed to move. Investigators worked in silence. But behind that silence, something massive was shifting. Witnesses were interviewed. Devices were seized. Flights and financial records were reconstructed like a timeline of power and access. By September 2024, the quiet broke. A federal grand jury returned a sweeping indictment charging Combs with racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking by force, fraud or coercion, and transporting individuals to engage in prostitution. He was arrested in New York, brought into Manhattan federal court, and he pleaded not guilty. Bail wasn't just denied, it was shut down brutally. From that moment, mogul wasn't the system's word for him anymore. Inmate was. The trial that followed in 2025 didn't feel like a normal celebrity case. It felt like a referendum. For nearly 2 months, witnesses walked into court and pulled stories out of their past that most people never imagined would see daylight. Old relationships, late-night flights, closed-door parties, hotel suites, everything was dissected, time-stamped, matched against phone records and messages. Federal agents testified about the alleged Combs enterprise, a machine built not just to make money but, according to prosecutors, to protect his power at any cost. He denied it all, but the jury watched every flinch, every nod, every glance. When the verdict finally came down that summer, it split the nation. The jury acquitted him on the most explosive counts, racketeering and sex trafficking, but found him guilty on federal charges related to transporting individuals to engage in prostitution. To some, that looked like escape. To others, it was still a rare conviction for a man who had once seemed untouchable. The sentence that followed was harsh enough to rewrite his immediate future: 40-plus months in federal prison. Reports said his projected release would land somewhere around the middle of 2028. Not a life sentence, but long enough to turn the next few years into steel, concrete, and routine. By October, the world knew where Sean Combs slept at night: a cell in a federal facility, FCI Fort Dix in New Jersey, a place built for structure and control, not chaos. A place where a high-profile inmate wasn't just another number, they were a security risk, a PR risk, a walking headline waiting to explode. Inside, his movements were supposed to be mapped out on paper. When he could shower, when he could call, when he could walk the yard or enter the chapel or the media library. High-risk prisoners don't drift. They are escorted, logged, watched. At least that's how the system writes the rules. Reality, as the world was about to find out, looked very different. In the weeks leading up to Thanksgiving, his life settled into something like a brutal rhythm. Guards who had grown up listening to his music now watched him shuffle past in faded institutional clothing. Other inmates stared, half curious, half resentful, trying to figure out whether his name still carried weight on the inside or whether it had turned into a target. On some days, he kept his head low and moved like any other man serving time. On others, there were rumors his name mentioned in hushed tones near the chapel, near the library, near places where high-profile inmates weren't supposed to linger without eyes on them. Somewhere between those rumors and the fluorescent buzz of Fort Dix's quietest corridors, a tiny lens was lifted, a risk was taken, and a choice was made that would flip his entire sentence upside down. It didn't happen in a courtroom. It didn't happen in front of a jury. It happened between the shelves of books and humming screens. At the exact moment, someone decided to film what was never meant to be seen. The footage didn't arrive with fanfare. It simply appeared late on the evening of November 23rd, dropped into the bloodstream of the internet like a small piece of shrapnel that no one recognized until it started tearing through everything. At first glance, it looked like bad security footage. Grainy, slightly shaky, nothing polished or cinematic. But then people realized what they were actually looking at. Rows of shelves, old computer monitors, a wall of religious books, the media library at Fort Dix, and right there in the center of the frame, in a gray sweatsuit and knit cap, was Sean Diddy Combs, changing his jacket as calmly as if he were in a backstage dressing room instead of a federal facility. The clip had no sound, but it didn't need any. His body language told its own story. He wasn't chained, he wasn't escorted. He moved slowly, deliberately, adjusting the jacket with the bored ease of someone who had done this 100 times. For a few seconds, he looked up, his eyes scanning the room not like a man terrified of breaking a rule, but like someone checking whether he was alone. Then he went back to what he was doing. The camera angle never shifted. It stayed low, hidden, the way someone would film if they knew what they were capturing could end careers. The caption that ran with the upload was simple and devastating. First ever prison video of Sean Diddy Combs. The internet didn't scroll past it. It slammed on the brakes. Within minutes, timelines filled with cropped screenshots of his face, his jacket, the shelves, the shadows around him. People argued about whether it was real, then about how it was possible, then about what it meant. Why was he there alone? How did a recording device enter a federal prison? Why was he in a controlled area with no guard in sight? Was this a favor, a blind spot, or proof that the rules didn't apply to him the way they applied to everyone else? Inside Fort Dix, alarms weren't blaring, but something worse was happening. Radios crackled with clipped voices. Supervisors were called away from their desks. A link began quietly circulating through internal email threads with 3 words in the subject line. Is this real? The answer landed like a punch to the gut when someone recognized the exact corner of the library from the surveillance blueprints. Same shelves, same angle, same clock on the wall. The first official response came fast and cold. The footage was not authorized. The prison was investigating. That single sentence, meant to distance the institution from the leak, had the opposite effect. If they didn't release it, then someone inside did. A guard, an inmate with access, a staff member, someone who had been close enough to stand behind a shelf and lift a phone toward one of the most closely watched inmates in the entire federal system. News outlets grabbed the story and twisted the volume to maximum. Former prison officials went on live TV to say how impossible this should be. Commentators framed it as proof of either corruption or collapse. Influencers reposted the clip with titles like "What They Don't Want You to See" and "Diddy's Secret Life Behind Bars." Every replay stripped away a little more of the prison's authority. Every reaction chipped at the judge's original sentence, making it look less like a punishment and more like a suggestion. While the public obsessed over every blurred pixel, something even more dangerous was unfolding behind the scenes. Internal investigators pulled surveillance footage from the library for the time window the leak appeared to show. Cameras that should have recorded everything returned a blank band of static, a gap of less than a minute, where nothing was saved. A glitch, the system called it. But put beside a smuggled clip clearly recorded in that same window, it didn't look like a glitch anymore. It looked like intent. One leak would have been devastating, but what came next made it feel like the first warning shot. On the morning of November 24th, as the first clip continued to dominate every timeline, a second video appeared, and this time, it was worse. The frame opened on a narrow corridor connecting the chapel wing to the media library, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The lens was steadier, the image clearer, and walking straight down the middle of that hallway was Diddy, unshackled, unescorted, moving with the kind of ease that made the rule books look like fiction. He wasn't dragging his feet. He wasn't hunched. There was even a faint, almost disbelieving smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Viewers argued over that expression more than anything. Some said he looked relaxed in a way no federal inmate should. Others swore they saw fear hiding behind the calm, a man forcing himself to look composed. But everything changed when he slowed down just before the end of the corridor, glanced behind him, and slipped sideways toward a blind spot where the hallway turned sharply out of view. A second figure appeared just at the edge of the frame, blurred, partially hidden, close enough to prove he wasn't alone, not close enough to identify. Diddy leaned slightly, his hand lifting toward his mouth the way people do when they don't want anyone to read their lips. Again, the clip was completely silent, but that silence didn't mute the moment. It weaponized it. Watching that footage, you didn't hear words, but you could feel secrets. If the first leak suggested a rule break, the second suggested something far more explosive. Unauthorized contact in a restricted corridor with no escort, no documentation, no restraints. The internet lost control of itself. Threads filled with screenshots tracing shadows, zooms on shoes, wild accusations about who the blurred figure might be: a guard, another inmate, someone from the outside. Conspiracy boards lit up. Talk shows asked if a famous federal prisoner was being allowed to move like a VIP in a building designed for confinement. The officials watching the same footage inside Fort Dix weren't thinking about drama. They were thinking about survival, because two facts were now undeniable. Someone inside had recorded him twice, and the official systems that were supposed to monitor his movements had failed either through negligence, incompetence, or something darker. Calls started from Washington. Emails landed from the Bureau of Prisons. Reporters requested comment from SDNY. The narrative had shifted again. It was no longer just Diddy caught on camera. It was, can the government even control him? And there's one thing federal judges can't afford in a case this public: the impression that their sentence isn't being taken seriously. Behind closed doors in Manhattan, that pressure crystallized into a single decision. There would be no waiting for the storm to pass. No quiet internal memo, no slow review. The order was short and brutal. Sean Combs was to be brought back to court immediately for an emergency hearing about his custody, his conduct, and the future of his sentence. When officers walked down the range toward his cell on that Thursday morning, everything felt different. Inmates who usually slammed their doors for privacy stayed at their windows, watching. Guards walked in a tighter formation. No one cracked a joke. No one made a comment. When they opened his door, he didn't ask why. He already knew. The chains tightened around his wrists, then his ankles, the metal connecting in the center like a cold, physical period at the end of a sentence he thought he understood. He was wrong. The transport convoy that carried him out of Fort Dix and toward Manhattan didn't look like a routine trip. Multiple vehicles, tinted windows, quiet lights instead of wailing sirens. The kind of movement designed to avoid attention, and yet somehow signaling how serious everything had become. Inside the van, he sat with his head bowed, the hum of the engine vibrating through the restraints, replaying the same questions everyone else had been asking, but for him they weren't theoretical. How did this happen? Who filmed it? And what was a federal judge going to do now that the whole country was watching evidence of his freedom inside the very place that was supposed to take it away? By the time the convoy rolled up to the courthouse entrance, the building looked less like a place of law and more like a siege zone. Barricades held back a wall of cameras. Reporters called his name, even though they knew he wouldn't answer. Every major network had broken into programming to cover the emergency hearing. Inside, security swallowed every hallway, U.S. Marshals at each door, extra scanners, elevators locked down just for this transport. This wasn't a mere procedural check-in. This was a reckoning. In a secure conference room just steps away from the courtroom, Judge Aaron Subramanian wasn't watching commentary. He was watching the clips again. He studied the way Diddy moved between the library shelves, how relaxed his shoulders looked, how casually he adjusted his jacket. On the second video, he watched the tilt of the head, the shift toward the blind corner, the angle of the unknown figure's approach. He watched not as a fan or a critic, but as the one person in this building with the legal power to decide whether the original sentence still made sense in a world where millions of people had witnessed what appeared, on its face, to be a breakdown of control. When Diddy was finally led into the courtroom, the air inside changed. Conversations died mid-whisper. Pens stopped moving. The chains at his wrists and ankles rattled just enough to echo. He kept his eyes down, but he could feel the heat of every stare on him. Prosecutors, marshals, clerks, members of the public who had managed to get seats after lining up before sunrise. To them, he wasn't just a defendant anymore. He was a test, a question, a symbol of whether the system could still impose consequences on someone whose power had once seemed limitless. The judge took his time before speaking. He didn't slam a gavel, didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at the man in front of him, then down at the printed stills taken from the leaked videos, and began. He described what the court had seen: unauthorized presence in a restricted area, movement without escort, apparent unmonitored contact with another individual in a controlled corridor. He noted the silence of the footage, the lack of audio, and how that vacuum had been filled by public suspicion. He acknowledged the statements from Fort Dix admitting the videos were not sanctioned. He talked about the gap in the official surveillance recordings, the unanswered questions, the missing documentation. Then he moved to what really mattered: not viral outrage, but trust. A federal sentence, he said, doesn't end at the moment the number's announced. It lives or dies on the integrity of the confinement that follows. The public believes in that structure because they are told it is strict, consistent, and fair. When footage leaks that appears to show a high-profile inmate enjoying a level of freedom completely at odds with official restrictions, that belief cracks. And once it cracks, it doesn't just threaten one case. It threatens the entire image of the court itself. Each word landed with the weight of something already decided. The prosecutors didn't need to grandstand. They spoke briefly, pointing to the damage the leaks had done to the perception of equal treatment, to the authority of the Bureau of Prisons, to the idea that his original sentence meant what the judge had intended that day. The prison officials, red-eyed and tense, admitted under questioning that they could not fully explain how or why he appeared where he did, when he did, on those recordings. No one could say for certain whether he had help. No one could promise it wouldn't happen again. When the judge asked if Diddy had anything to say, the room seemed to lean forward. For a moment, he looked like he might speak. His lips parted. His eyes lifted just enough to meet the bench. But whatever words he might have found died before they formed. He swallowed them, dropped his gaze back to the table, and the silence that followed was louder than anything he could have offered. The judge inhaled slowly, exhaled once, and delivered the part of the hearing that will be replayed in clips for years. He began by restating the original sentence, a term measured in years, based on the convictions the jury had delivered and the facts before the court at that time. Then carefully, he explained how the situation had changed, not because of media pressure alone, he said, but because the new evidence those two clips showed a failure of confinement so serious that it undermined the very premise of the punishment imposed. The court, he insisted, could not pretend it hadn't seen what everyone else had watched in slow motion for the last 4 days. And then he said it. In light of the evidence of unauthorized movement, the unexplained breakdown in supervision, In the resulting collapse of public confidence in the integrity of this incarceration, the court was modifying the sentence. The fixed term of years was vacated. In its place, effective immediately, Sean Combs was sentenced to life in federal prison. For a second, the room didn't move. It was as if the words needed time to sink into the air, to settle onto every shoulder, to drive fully into the mind of the man standing in chains beneath them. Diddy's head snapped up, his eyes wide, disbelief and shock crashing together in a single expression that didn't look like the confident figure from old red carpets or music videos. It looked like a man realizing his countdown had just been replaced by an endless horizon. Somewhere behind him, someone gasped, quickly stifled. A pen dropped. One of the marshals tightened their grip on his arm as his knees threatened to give out. The judge continued, almost clinically, outlining that the modification would not be subject to appeal in this context. The leaks, the behavior, the collapse of trust they left, in his words, no acceptable alternative. As the hearing ended, there was no dramatic outburst, no final defiant speech. Just the scrape of a chair, the shuffle of restrained steps, the low clink of chains as he was turned back toward the door he'd entered through. Cameras waited in the hallways to capture his face, but his head stayed low, gaze locked on the floor, as if there were nothing left in front of him worth seeing. The man who once moved entire industries with a phone call now moved only when the chain between his ankles allowed it. Outside, the headlines wrote themselves: prison access scandal, life sentence after leaked footage, federal system pushed past its limit. Inside countless homes, people watched the clips again, one from the library, one from the chapel corridor, and now one more in their minds. A man standing in a courtroom on a Thursday in late November, hearing that the rest of his life would be spent behind the walls that had already failed to contain him once. If you stayed with this story to the end, make sure you hit like so more people see how deep this case really goes. Tell me in the comments whether you think this life sentence is justice or a reaction to public pressure, and subscribe with the bell turned on so you don't miss the next chapter in this investigation.